Hello again, Year 8. Good morning. This week we're going to be, through the medium of Dickensian characters, we're going to be exploring and writing an essay. But before we get on to that, do now list all the adult characters you have met in Dickens's work who aren't villains. That might take a little more thought than you at first imagine, because some of them can appear like villains, but if you think about them in the context of the whole story, they're rather more complex than that. So just make that list and then on to the next slide. Our learning objective today is exploring techniques for writing successful essays, and the title is Essay Writing. As ever, a quick check as we're still working remotely. Make sure you've got a pen, your exercise book, and your notes from previous lessons, which will of course be in your exercise book. Do now review. You could have written Bob Cratchit, Stephen Blackpool, Scrooge or Nancy. Put a little asterisk next to Scrooge and Nancy because they're more complex characters, but they aren't completely villainous, are they? Scrooge quite obviously becomes a much better man at the end of A Christmas Carol. Nancy's even more complex than that. She's capable of doing bad things and good things, but she's very much trapped by the society she's been born into. But we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a bit. Hopefully you got most of those. So we're over the next lessons, as I say, we're going to be exploring the techniques involved in essay writing, but through the prism, as we have with all of this module, of Dickens's characters. So over the next 4 lessons, we'll be recapping the characters you've met in order to prepare you to write an essay response. The lessons will be themed on the following adults who aren't villains, and children. Who aren't villains, and then villains and children, excuse me. In the 4th lesson, you will pick one character to focus your essay on, and then you're going to email that to me or upload it onto Classcharts. And hopefully it will tie everything we've learned together. Not hopefully, it definitely will. Just as a little exercise, write down over the next 5 minutes what you think you should include in an essay. This is the Marc Scheme. The Marc Scheme being the thing that we look at when we're looking at your essay, and we decide how well you've hit these markers. You see grade 2, 3 and 4, 2 obviously being the lowest, 3 and 4 being higher, and you can see how the requirements change as you go up. We'll go into a little more detail on the next slide. Right, colour keyed that. Grade 4, the highest grade, let's look at that. In yellow, starts to build an argument based on presentation of the character or theme. This means that you need to consistently show your opinion. So make up your idea what your opinion is and stick to it, and consistently show it throughout the essay by making sure all your points build onto each other. In green there, ideas are becoming detailed and developed. This means that you need to make sure that your ideas are detailed. In the light blue there, evidence is well chosen and supportive. That's evidence is quotations, and they need to be relevant and back up your points well. In purple, starts to discuss language and structure confidently and may use correct terminology. This means that you talk about the language and structural devices that Dickens uses to achieve certain effects. So we've done loads of that. That's Peel, isn't it? You know, it's close word analysis and talking about structure. In the dark blue, the reader is considered throughout the whole piece. You need to include how a reader may respond. This could be a contemporary reader in the 19th century or a modern audience. So that's when you get into the really high marks there. If you're saying, comparing perhaps how an audience of the time, Dickens's Victorian audience, would react to what he's writing compared with how we react as a modern audience. And then in red there, contextual details are linked to their ideas. You need to consider factors that it would have influenced Dickens's writing. That can be historical or social. For example, a lot of his work is set during the Industrial Revolution, but it can also be knowledge of the characters and their stories. That is context. And you could say, for example, Nancy, who is both good and bad, is unable to escape the horrible life she's in because at that time there were no opportunities for women without an no opportunities for women at all, in fact, to improve themselves. So she's completely stuck. That's a context. See, that wouldn't happen now. So that's relevant context of the time. So, in today's lesson, we're going to focus on adult characters who aren't villains. So, for the next 15 minutes, for each of these characters in the pictures on the left down there, write what you remember about them, what stories they appear in, and how are each of them affected by Victorian society. Okay, Bob Cratchit from Scrooge. He works for Scrooge. He's kind and mild, very poor man with a large family. He's treated harshly by his boss. Cratchit remains a humble and dedicated employee. He appears in A Christmas Carol. How is he affected by Victorian society? Even though he's working, his family is still very poor. He cannot afford to pay for medical treatment for his son, Tiny Tim. He does have a very close-knit family, despite the poverty. Dickens felt strongly that Victorian society ignored the poverty of its underclass. On the one hand were the rich who enjoyed comfort and feasting at Christmas, and on the other were children forced to live in dreadful conditions in workhouses. So, you've got your notes on Bob Cratchit. Anything on here that you haven't got, add to your notes. Stephen Blackpool, poor old Stephen. What do you remember about them? Stephen Blackpool worked as a hand in Bounderby's factory. Stephen is an important character not only because his poverty and virtue contrast with Bounderby's wealth and self-interest. He appeared in Hard Times. How was he affected by Victorian society? Stephen refuses to join the workers' union because he is worried about causing more tension between workers and employers. He is ultimately treated very badly as a result. The Industrial Revolution further emphasised the gap between rich and poor, and Dickens uses Stevens to show how the revolution could threaten moral integrity. So anything on there that you haven't got on your notes, add to your notes. Nancy. What do you remember about Nancy? She dies to save Oliver's life and she loves Sikes. She is a complex character, is capable of both good and evil. What story does she appear in Oliver Twist? How are each of them affected by Victorian society? So how is Nancy affected? Nancy is an interesting character. She's forced into a life of crime largely because of poverty and her love for Sikes. She has grown up on the streets and therefore, in order to survive, has had to commit crime, as Victorian society did not allow for someone like Nancy to overcome poverty because there wasn't, well, I wouldn't say there probably wasn't any opportunity for her to do that. And good old Scrooge. What do you remember about him? Scrooge is initially a selfish and unfeeling man, but once he has shown the error of his ways, he changes his behaviour and starts treating people well. He appears in A Christmas Carol. How was he affected by Victorian society? Scrooge is advantaged by Victorian society. He's doing very well, thank you very much. He is successful in his work and is obsessed with gaining wealth. Many wealthy Victorians believed that the poor were lazy and had no sympathy with them. We see this attitude in Scrooge when the charity men ask him for money. I can't afford to make idle people merry. Dickens uses Scrooge to show the benefits of generosity and selflessness to allow readers to reflect on their own behaviour. So as usual, add anything on there that you think, well, it's all relevant, that you haven't got in your own notes. Now here's the task and the very thing that I want you to upload onto Classcharts for me to have a look at. Pick one of the characters we've looked at today to focus on and write a paragraph to respond to the question, how do you think Victorian society shaped Dickens's characters? So you're going to pick one of the characters and write just a paragraph on that, okay? Just spend 15 minutes on it. And if you want to, you can do some additional research for your chosen character. There's some good information on Spark Notes or Bite Size. But yeah, looking forward to reading those, Year 8. Always a pleasure receiving your work. So enjoy, and I will speak to you next time.